Hello, and welcome to Arvos of Harvo. This is the reading log that I'm going to do for July, and this month I happened to read a lot of science fiction or technology-themed books. I think I had 4 main sci-fi books before I started to lose it, and so I had to have something a bit different. But this month, because everything is so technology-themed, I figured that I would also upgrade my tech a little bit. So camera looks a little bit better. You can actually almost see out of my window now. It is the afternoon, so I probably won't have enough time to do every single one of these, but let's see how far we go. Book number 1 is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. I do not understand the concept of left and right, and I am not re-recording the intro. This is a really hard book to find. I went through a lot of different thrift stores trying to get a copy of this, and when I first found it, I was excited but also apprehensive because I'd heard a lot of people say that this is quite a challenging book to read. I didn't really know what it was about at all, really. The title, Cloud Atlas, is very provocative, and I also knew that the Coen brothers, some famous director, tried to make it, and then everyone said it was too ambitious, too difficult. So I didn't know what this was about at all, and I was really quite surprised when I read it. So part of the book is that you're actually supposed to figure out what it is as you read, and I really don't want to ruin any of the surprise. So if a very postmodern, very form-based book is interesting to you, a book that's very interested in different historical periods, how human beings connect throughout time, and being able to mimic a lot of different styles of writing, if that would be impressive to you, then stop the video now and go read Cloud Atlas and come back and we'll talk about it. But for everyone else who doesn't care as much, so this is really 7-ish novella things set through different periods of history, and each one goes through really a different genre. So we start with one of the most accurate renditions of a Pacific ship journal that I've ever read. So coming off Moby Dick from last month, reading the earliest chapter of Cloud Atlas, I was like, this is so authentic. This is the sentence structure, the way they pay attention to little details of the ship, the racism, all of that is so accurate to that style of writing that I was a little bit destabilized because, well, why? I thought I was reading a sci-fi book, and instead I get this opening chapter set on an 1800 whaling ship. Now, I think that's what a lot of people have as an issue with this book, because they come into it expecting something bang, wow, amazing, and the start is slow. The start is very slow. The second chapter is an epistolary novel about a composer who's hightailing, like hiding away in a more renowned composer's house and falls in love with his daughter. That also jumps, I think, a couple of decades into the future as well. And so every section jumps a little bit more forward into history, becomes a different genre, and somehow includes elements from the previous story as well. I don't want to make it sound like this is some kind of big interconnected thing where every detail is relevant, because it's not. You don't need to pay so much attention to the little details of each individual one. You can instead just read this as separate stories, 7 separate stories, which get interrupted midway to go to the next one, and then eventually they all come back and resolve themselves, but they don't congeal into one big, grand arch narrative. And I don't know if that's what I wanted. I don't know if I would have preferred it if by the end of the story everything kind of ties together, because it's tied together by motifs and tied together by overall themes of human beings saving each other at the expense of corrupt systems. This is a book that really hates systemic things and really loves the capacity of one individual human being to save another human being. And so it rails against everything systemic, from racism to class structures to work to technology to anything that homogenizes human beings, and instead talks about how, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of how far in the past or how far in the future things get, the propensity for one human being to show love and care for another human being is the most valuable thing. And so that does lead to some quite beautiful moments. There are some real standouts here, and I feel like David Mitchell is better at the sci-fi than he is at the historical fiction, because the science fiction sections of this book are by far the best ones. But if you zoom out and you look at every novella-ish section on its own terms, they're fine, they're okay, they're not amazing. Nothing in this book is absolutely amazing, because I feel like it had to have been simplified in order to make the overall narrative structure work. And so because every story is going to get chopped into two, and a big amount of distance is going to be placed between the beginning and the ending, they have to be kind of simplified stories. And so I can't really complain at that. I think it's still one of the most unique books that I've read, just in the way that it's structured. It's so unusual, it's so weird. And the premise, I'm putting this in my on-premise category, the premise of reading 7 books smashed together like this, with each one jumping into a future one, and having these little interconnections between them, and just being bewildered by the possibility that happens. Every time you go to a new story, you have to reorientate yourself to think, well, where am I now? Where has this sent me now? Where have I woken up? Who am I inhabiting? What kind of story am I experiencing? How is David Mitchell going to up the stakes again? Because every story is a bit more than the subsequent one as well. It's a bit more drama, a bit more intrigue, a bit more thematic relevance to the overall themes. I think that the reading experience can be quite enjoyable, can also be quite challenging. I think there are a lot of good things to say about this novel, and I would give it a 4 out of 5. I had a good time. Book number 2 for July. So I was really lucky. I got the chance to go to my friend Zeynab's book launch, and her first novel, The Scope of Permissibility, is my pick for 2023. This was great. This was really enjoyable. This was so many things that I realized don't exist in the Australian publishing scene, because it's quite light, it's realistic, it's set on a university campus, and it's about 3 individuals who partake in the Muslim Students Society, or the Muslim Students Association at their university. And this is a really interesting space that the author has fleshed out and complicated and expanded, because I think society has a very homogenous attitude towards Muslims, and to have a novel which shows 3 characters from 3 different cultures, but all 3 are bound together by their faith, that's a new dynamic that I've never really seen done before, and I find it really, really interesting. The idea that different people come to relationships, come to their worldviews with attitudes that are common because of their religion, and disparate because of their upbringing, their culture, their ethnicity, and having to navigate that space to actually figure out, how am I going to form meaningful friendships, meaningful relationships? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be moral? And what does it mean to be faithful? That's something that is just so rich and so complex and so well executed in this novel. So we have 3 characters who we switch between. We have Naeem, who is a young man who's kind of like the golden child. He got a grade A. He is doing, I want to say medicine, like a really prestigious degree, and so he's looked up to by a lot of these characters, but him personally is in this state of kind of lack of confidence because of family situations and because of his status as well. And from there we have Abida, who's a young woman who's she's very ambitious towards the way that she sees the Muslim Students Association. She is very driven and a natural leader, and this pushes her to vie for the presidency of this society, and that brings with it its own little sets of conflicts as well. I quite appreciated that Abida's narrative is not a romantic subplot, so we get quite interesting contrasts between each of the different characters. And the last one we have is Sarah, who is from South Africa, and her narrative is quite contrasting to the others, because her surname is Andrews. She can appear European or white to certain characters, and so that puts her in another position of difference and trying to figure out her place within this Muslim society. It's just a lot. It's just really interesting and complex, and yet the writing style is quite breezy. I think what this novel does really well is thread that needle between the complicated and the social spaces that have this layer of depth to them, but also have just quite elegantly simple subplots that are easy to follow. Every chapter has something just nice and enjoyable, whether it's romantic interactions, or whether it's hanging out with friends, whether it's just the reality of being a young person at university and trying to figure out what your role in life is. I just had a really enjoyable time reading this, and I found out a lot more about all of these characters and their backgrounds as well. I think just the complexity of the social lives and the internal lives of these characters really come out on the page, and so I would give this a 4 out of 5. I had a really, really great time. Book number 3 is Persuasion by Jane Austen. This is the last Jane Austen novel that I will ever read in my life. I am never going to do any of these again. I finished all 6, and I always thought I was saving the best for last. Everyone says that Persuasion is the best of her novels. I want to do a video later this year ranking them or discussing them and looking at all 6 of them together. I'm not going to read Lady Susan. I'm not going to read any of the Juvenilia or anything like that. I think that keeping it just to the big 6 works for me. I've read all of her books out of obligation. What am I going to say? I'm not the biggest Austen fan. I just don't like her particular style that much. And I can appreciate why she's so significant and why she's so important, how she is a figure that really reshapes what the novel is and how different people conceive of novels. And I do agree that all of her works, most of her works hold up to this day. I would recommend Persuasion. I would say that this is definitely worth reading. It's just, you've got to jump through a lot of hoops to get there. And I think part of it too is my own personal experiences. I am not connected to England in any way, so English culture to me doesn't really matter. I'm not really someone who experienced the 1800s attitudes of social class. I don't have any family that connect to that kind of vibe at all. And I've never owned a manor. I've never had to really think about inheritances or social standings or any of that complex stuff that Austen does really well. And I also every now and then find the humor just a little bit grating, just a little bit mean-spirited. Austen is not above a good roast. She will absolutely roast a character if she thinks that they're being conceited or pompous or even just a little bit ignorant. They get made fun of. And part of the appeal of these books is being able to judge people and be able to laugh at people and go, they are not behaving in the correct way. The protagonist is behaving in the correct way. And it's a method of rewarding and punishing different attitudes towards romance and social class and society. And to me, who is so removed from that, just didn't really do it for me. And one last dynamic as well, which I really can't ignore, but it doesn't apply to me at all. Her novels really push sisterly friendship or feminine friendship. 2 women having intellectual conversations, supporting each other, comparing and contrasting their lives with each other as well, being aware that different values and attitudes can exist, and this doesn't always have to place women in conflict with each other. I think that is a huge dynamic of her novels that I can appreciate, or I can respect, but I, of course, can't relate to. So, as an early child, as a man, it's a dynamic of the novel that I'll never really be able to enjoy. I think that for Persuasion's sake, this novel is the most mature of Austen's novels. It's also the most well-planned and well-plotted. We follow, I'm going to remember her name, Anne Elliot, who is sadly one of the oldest protagonists that Austen's written about. She's 28, which is not that old, but older than the other ones. And so she's in a situation where she's already had some of the decisions of her life made for her, and she's re-meeting someone who, way before, a couple of years before, their relationship didn't work out. She's meeting Captain Wentworth, and before they kind of agreed that the relationship wouldn't work for various social issues, she'd been persuaded by a close confidant to say that this relationship wouldn't work, and now as an adult, as someone who can make her own decisions, she's now got to reassess whether the choices of the past were correct or not. And so this leads to a much more psychological and mature novel compared to a lot of other of Jane Austen's works. None of the characters really embody social virtues or vices. It's not as simple as sense and sensibility. It is a bit more slow in that I think the first couple of chapters, there's no real push to the narrative because the characters are just kind of meeting each other, they're getting used to each other's company. It's not as bad as something like Mansfield Park, where the first half of the novel is just floating around. This novel does get to the point, but at the same time, it's still not pacey in the way that a modern reader might expect it. Now, what is amazing about this book, though, is the ending. I think the last couple of chapters are by far the best things that Austen has ever written. Just the way that some of the things are phrased, the way that people express their emotions, and you realize that everything's kind of been building up towards this. All the characters have been carefully watching their words and their tone, and towards the end, when all of these restrained feelings get let out, it's just very, very well written, very well put together. I see why people say this is the best one, because the last couple of chapters, there's nothing like it across all of Austen's catalogue. But overall, though, I think this is not my favourite plot of Austen. I think that this is worth reading, certainly. It's one of the better ones. I would give it a 4 out of 5 too. Okay, it's the next day. It's pretty dark, but let's keep going with this. Next book for July was Dune by Frank Herbert. Now, I tried so many times to read this. This is the third attempt that I ever made to read this book, and this is the first time I finished it. Every time I would get through maybe about 100 or so pages, and I would just get bored, because the initial novel just has so much setup. There's just so much world that needs to happen in the first 100 or so pages, and then the novel starts becoming more of a adventure-y, epic type of novel. I think that once I got through that initial barrier, I could get through the rest of the novel. The only issue is that it's one of those books with a glossary, right? Towards the end, there's a dictionary of 5 or 6 pages of different terminology, and it's kind of understandable why it is this way. This is epic science fiction. This is not just a straightforward story about one person in one situation. This is about the fate of planets and whole houses and families and the geopolitics of intergalactic space travel, right? This is really, really dense, complicated sci-fi. But as I say that, it's also not that difficult. It's not impossible. I think I used to build this book up as one of the densest, one of the most difficult science fiction novels. And while it is hard, I also want to say it's quite doable. One thing I will say about this is that as a epic, as a space opera, it hits a lot of the same plot beats that you would expect from things like the genre. I always compare it to Star Wars, because I think that a lot of the events that happen here, a lot of the tropes are common with Star Wars. But the things that makes Dune unique is the way that you feel about all the events which happen is totally different. This book gave me so much paranoia, so much uncertainty, because none of the characters can really be trusted. None of them have healthy relationships with each other. Everyone is trying to backstab everyone at every turn, and it leads to a really difficult reading experience, because you can't really take anything at face value in this book. Everything is grounded in history, is grounded in tradition, in a lot of extra backstory, and so if you want to put the effort into actually learning all the details and the history of the novel, then it is a rich and rewarding experience. But if you don't want that, then once you get past the first 200 pages, you can still read it as an adventure novel and have a pretty good time. Now, I do want to talk about some things that include spoilers, and to some people, I think the true Dune experience is to be thrown into the world with no context. And so if that is you, or if you want the same confusion that I had, then by all means jump right in and skip the next bit. But there are a few things that I would have found really, really helpful before I started reading. And first of all is that this book is set thousands and thousands of years into the future, after an apocalypse, after this whole other thing has changed the nature of humanity. So humanity as we know it today expanded in the lore of this book to a point where they had automated machines for everything. They could have machines which thought for themselves, they could do everything that humanity wanted, but these machines became too powerful, there was some kind of unknown calamity, and so human laws were made to prevent the existence of any sentient machine objects. This all happens way before the book even starts. And then from there, you have to imagine a race of humanity that is still intelligent, has all the same kind of qualities as before, but without any thinking technology, without any thinking machines. And so the logical result of that is that different factions of humans train themselves and train their bodies to a point where they attain what might look to us like supernatural powers. And each of these different schools, there's 2 main ones that exist in the first Dune novel, which are the Mentats, who have trained themselves to basically understand wisdom on a greater level. They can see we can kind of read thoughts based on perception. They can see into the future sometimes. And there's also the Bene Gesserit, who are a sort of religious order who, again, have telepathic or supernatural powers just based on how much concentration and how much observation they have. They can do things like recognize a person in another room based on their movements or their sounds. They can do things like understand whether someone is telling the truth or telling a lie based on little tiny mannerisms. And the more you're trained in this, then the stronger that you get. But this training itself is quite harsh and restrictive on an individual. They have to be brought up in this very specific way to a point where it seems almost inhuman to us. And that's what makes this novel so difficult, is that certain characters will say things like, oh, I've been trained as a mentat, or I'm trained in the Bene Gesserit ways. And to us, it doesn't really mean anything, but once you grasp all the lore of the novel, then it starts to mean some more things. And I never saw the film of this, by the way. I've only ever read this book and listened to a bit of the audiobook, so I'm going to pronounce everything wrong. They go to the planet called Arrakis, or Arrakis. In my head, I still say Arrakis. This is a desert planet, and this is a planet which contains these sandworms they have on the cover. This cover actually spoils everything, so I'm not going to hold it too close to the screen. It contains these giant worms that produce spice, and spice is it's sort of hallucinogenic drug, but it also is key to intergalactic space travel. So it's a really valuable resource. You can think of it as basically crude oil. Like, this planet is filled with crude oil, but it is inhospitable. It is a desert planet. It contains these creatures that are enormous and will just destroy people, destroy colonies, and destroy civilizations. And it also has unpredictable weather, unpredictable dust storms, very hard to live. And so this novel is really about the conflict between two political houses in this world. Again, there's all these different factions it's hard to get a hold of. There's the Atreides, who are the protagonists. Paul Atreides is the hero that we tend to follow, and they are something of a compassionate house. One of the qualities that's ascribed to them is that they treat their members like family. They hold their members really closely. Their leader, Duke Leto, is known for being kind and open-minded to the point of being naive, and their rivals are the Harkonnens. The Harkonnens are known for being warlike, uncompromising, very harsh, but also very empire-oriented. And so they're vying over control for this planet Dune, where the Harkonnens had been mining spice on Dune for the last couple of years, and then, for some reason, they've ceded over power and control of Dune, or Arrakis, to the Atreides. Meanwhile, on the planet itself, there's a third faction called the Fremen. They are kind of like indigenous humans to this planet. They've lived there for a much longer time. They've adapted and gotten used to the climate and the lifestyle there, to the point where they have all this extra secrecy that both the Atreides and the Harkonnens don't fully understand. And so the Harkonnens, their attitude towards the Fremen was of extermination or of fear. They wanted to take over the land, whereas the Atreides see more value in working with the Fremen or creating some kind of relationship from them, gaining wisdom from them. It's not hard to see this novel as an allegory for colonization, specifically the kinds of empire-based colonization that happened in the 1700s, the 1800s, where Britain, Spain, Portugal, the Dutch, all these global powers were going to, for them, undiscovered territory like Australia and North and South America, and setting up colonies there and having various attitudes towards the indigenous peoples of those areas. At the same time, there's two other larger factions. There's the overall empire, the emperor who dictates all the laws and all the interactions between all of the houses, and there's also the Chom company, who is responsible for all the finances, all the economics. They dictate how markets are supposed to work. So we have all this extra complexity, and that makes this novel so hard to read, just because you don't immediately understand the stakes of everything. You don't really understand how important it is for a character to be connected with Chom, or to have the Emperor's approval, or even to be a Harkonnen or an Atreides. I found that once you did get these definitions, it started to feel actually a little bit shallow, because the Atreides have their qualities, the Harkonnens have their qualities, the Fremen eventually become a new player of their own. It's spelt out for you, almost as if you're reading a textbook, and that factual nature of some of those things takes away from the pleasure of discovery. I feel like in some chapters of this novel, I'm just doing homework. I'm trying to figure out truths, which is not that enjoyable of a reading experience. I think it's really remarkable that Frank Herbert managed to tie together all of this, that he could imagine such a rich world with so much detail and so much thought into how human beings survive here, what kinds of geopolitics have been happening for centuries and centuries, and how that connects allegorically to our real world and our real history here, but also how it can be something new and alien for readers to really dive into if they want. It is immersive, it is kind of terrifying. It gave me some really weird anxiety nightmares just because of how little people can trust each other in this world. I give it a 4 out of 5. It's a good book, and there's a lot to gain out of it. I did not enjoy it as much as some of the other ones this month, but I think it is monumentally significant science fiction. It really holds up, even though it's from the 1960s. It feels weighty, it feels meaningful. It's worth reading, even for how difficult it is. Okay, and book number 4, this is The Drowned World by J.G. Ballard. I don't really know that much about J.G. Ballard. He is known for some very unusual science fiction novels. He's known for Crash, which is about car crash fetishism. He's known for High Rise, which is about this future skyscraper that has all amenities required for people so they never need to leave the building. And he has The Drowned World, which many people cite as one of the earliest examples of climate fiction. This is a novel where the sun's rays somehow strengthen and melt all the ice caps and flood the whole world. And yeah, it's an apocalypse novel. It's alright. I think the fact that it's such an early example of climate fiction means that it doesn't have the same relationship between humans and nature that I really wanted out of a book like this. I think because it was written in the 60s and it predates a lot of actual genuine climate science, it doesn't have that same sense of urgency or responsibility on the part of the human characters. It still shows human characters trying to make peace with nature, thinking that they have no real control or responsibility for the world around them. I guess it kind of does a little bit, but nowhere near the strength of modern climate fiction. I think really the only commonalities that you get are that the world is flooded and people are coping with the ramifications of climate change. And here it is like science fiction, unknowable circumstance climate change. It's not even man-made climate change, right? And from there we get kind of frustratingly a adventure novel that reminds me a lot of the Joseph Conrad, who's the other guy? William Golding kind of adventure novels. It reminds me a lot of Lord of the Flies, or Heart of Darkness, in that they want to show the darkness of human nature, but they do this by giving you characters that you don't really care that much about. And they also do this by thinning out the plot and revealing shocking things as if they're really supposed to get at you. I don't know, it felt a bit outdated to me the way the storytelling was done. I didn't care too much for any of the characters. I also really didn't like that the one woman in all of this, Beatrice, she's such a woman written by men to appeal to men. She's like, it's the world's end. She lives in this lavish penthouse. She suntans in a bikini on the top of the roof and like teases all the men about their actions. I'm just like, why would you put that in there? What are you trying to say by doing that? It's just, I felt pandered to, and I hate it when I get pandered to. And the other characters too don't feel super strong. The overall plot, it does have some things happen, but not that many things happen. You can kind of see where it's going, and it doesn't really reach any satisfying conclusion. Maybe I'm reading it wrong, but I also think that there are so many other better examples of climate fiction that I don't really recommend people going back to The Drowned World unless they want to see the origins of where this began. So I would give this a 2 out of 5. Book number 6, this is in translation. This is a 3-way poem by Cixin Liu. I'm probably still pronouncing it wrong. I really should have looked it up. Even though I speak Chinese, what am I doing? He's actually got the same surname as me, which is fun. It's one of the most popular surnames in the world, so I don't feel that special. Also translated by Ken Liu, another one that shares my surname. So this is really good science fiction. This is really compulsive science fiction. It's also science fiction where it's kind of good to not know anything going into it, because if I were to tell you what real tropes are valuable in this novel and what real tropes are red herrings, then it kind of takes out the fun of reading it. So of all the science fiction books that I've read this month, out of Cloud Atlas, Dune, The Drowned World, this one, I would say this one is both the most compelling and the most accessible, and perhaps also the most meaningful about human nature. Maybe this is just my interpretation of it, but I really enjoyed it, and I think that the best experience is to go in without really knowing anything. So if you're interested at all in reading this series, the trilogy starts from the three-body problem, then it goes to the Dark Forest, and then it has Death End. If you want to read those, then go for it. Don't watch the rest of the video. I will have to talk about it just a little bit. So if you don't care, then this novel is how do I go about describing it? This novel is really, really compulsive. In fact, I think it has one of the strongest opening acts to any adventure novel, any science fiction novel, any real genre fiction novel that I've read in recent memory. It starts in the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 1960s. We have a lot of really brutal scenes of infighting between various Red Guard factions. We have characters whose names we will know to be significant later on, and their connections to various revolutionary movements, but also their experiences in re-education during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and also their experiences and connections to science. And that's about the first 30-40 pages, and then we jump into our modern day. We have a researcher named Wang. He is an expert in nanotechnology, and he is called into a police meeting by just a magnificent asshole of a character, Dashi, everyone calls him Dashi or Big Shi. He's a police officer who just has no real regard or respect for the rules or for how he comes across. He comes across as really rude, but he's also very pragmatic, very funny. And the protagonist, Wang, basically gets pulled into the narrative out of spite against Dashi. He's like, I don't want this guy to succeed. And so my actions, for the most part, are going to be motivated by going against what this person wants. And then over the course of the novel, Dashi becomes a much more meaningful character. You see more depth and complexity to him. He's probably one of the reasons why I enjoyed this novel so much. But the premise so far is that in the modern day, a bunch of really highly regarded, very famous scientists have been dying in really suspicious circumstances, and it's connected to an organization called the Frontiers of Science. And so Wang is called into a international police meeting to try and figure out what's going on with this. He's asked to investigate the Frontiers of Science, and this investigation leads him to a strange video game called The Three-Body Problem, where he's in this VR suit where he can experience hot and cold and all other sensations, and it's in a planet with 3 suns. And in physics, the three-body problem refers to the fact that if there are 3 objects, all 3 with gravitational pulls, then it's basically impossible to accurately predict how those objects will revolve. So in a universe with 3 suns, there's no regular nights or day, hot cycles or cold cycles. There's just no way of mathematically predicting it. And so playing this game, he needs to try and figure out what this virtual world is, who made this virtual world, and what is the purpose of it, and how is this connected to the string of mysterious deaths of all these scientists. And then it's so compelling. Every chapter ends with this interesting cliffhanger. There's just multiple threads being pulled along, because on one hand, you're interested in this murder mystery about Wang and his search for these dead scientists and the reason behind their deaths, but also in the virtual world, we have this puzzle of the 3 suns and how he's going to try and fix that. Tied in together are lots of all these little other red herring moments, and you just want to keep reading. As I was reading this, I just wanted to know more. I wanted to know so much more, and I thought it was so clever the way the author weaves in historical details, but also real scientific concepts. He knows a lot about science, and he has this really eloquent afterward where he actually talks about his relationship with science and his connection between science and literature, where it's a really respectable novel. And I also like the way that exposition, whether it's about the novel's world or whether it's about scientific concepts, that's all well connected to these overarching mysteries, so that you just want to know. This is a book where the more you read, the more you want to know. It's such a fascinating look into conspiracies and the frontiers of science, like scientific concepts. It's just very, very interesting. I enjoyed it very greatly. It is very much, though, book one of a trilogy. And finishing this, I wanted to read the next one immediately, but I also I didn't get a full sense of closure that I wanted to. And so I would have to give it a 4 out of 5. I wonder what the full series would look like. But for what it's worth, the first act of this novel is incredible. And as it develops, it's still very compelling, still very enjoyable. Before I forget to, one of the key themes of this novel, and one of the things I think makes it very valuable, is that it's about humanity as a whole. It's not a book about Chinese culture, it's not a book about countries or nations or individuals. It's a book about humanity as a collective. What is the nature of humanity? How does humanity relate to the universe around us? And what are the innate qualities of humanity that make it worth saving or make it worth destroying? It's philosophical, but not densely philosophical. It gives you all these interesting hypothetical situations, and that's also a big part of my enjoyment of the novel as well, is that it actually made me think quite deeply about my political views, my experiences, and how I view the human race and my own role in the human race. That's something that I think is so hard to achieve in science fiction, but this one does it so well. So yes, good things. Last one for the month. I know I only did 4 science fiction novels and I call it a science fiction month, but science fiction is so long. I finished this on the last day of July. This is Bonjour, Tristesse, I'm pronouncing that wrong, but absolutely, by Francoise Sagan, again, pronouncing it wrong. And this is a short romance, coming-of-age novella. I had to read it in just a single day because it was July 31st and I didn't want to wait any longer. This is about 30,000 words, very short. You can read it very easily in a day. It's nice. It's quite enjoyable. I was really surprised at how much I enjoyed it, actually, because it's written in the 1950s, and I often think about older novels that it might not have values that are relevant to today, or it might be hard for me to get into, whereas this one just breezed right by. I thought the narrator was so easy to follow, the language was really easy to follow as well. The translation was very good, it's translated from French. So what I didn't know was that Francoise Sagan was 18 when this novella was published. It's her first one. And she's also writing about a teenager. So the voice, to me, came across as a bit more authentic than a lot of older novelists writing about teenagers. It's about a young girl and her single father who travel to a holiday house in the French countryside. Her father is a kind of womanizing figure, a libertine, as the novel describes, someone who values personal freedoms, individuality, much more than being in a stable relationship. And the daughter takes on a lot of those same values as well. She believes in romance for the sake of emotion and for thrills. She gets into a relationship with a man named Cyril, who's about 10 years older than her, mainly because he's thrilling to her. And in all of this, her father gets or becomes married to, or engaged, I think, I can't remember now, long-term relationship with a older woman named, I want to say Anne. Forms a long-term relationship with Anne. And so Celine's now really conflicted because she's never really had a proper mother figure in her life because her father is a libertine. And now that he's marrying Anne, she needs to consider for herself, the protagonist needs to consider, well, how do I feel about this person? Do I respect their values? Is she someone that I eventually want to be, or that I want to take advice from, or do I go and fully reject her? And so Celine, the protagonist, decides to fully reject her. She stages this plot to try and break them up. And by doing this, she learns a lot about herself and a lot about what it really means to be free or to be in a relationship. It's very emotional towards the end. I thought it was just done so well. The characters and the motivations are so clear. The language is really crisp as well. It's tied together really nicely with just the beauty of the French countryside as well. It's just a great little book. For 30,000 words, I would say that every moment, every piece of dialogue, every character, every little snippet, it's all working very well towards creating this nice aesthetic moment, showing a snapshot in a teenage girl's coming of age, which is very honest and very heartfelt. And for all of that, I would give it a 4 out of 5. Alright, so that's my 7 books for July. I've got 4 significant sci-fi titles and 3 other things. Maybe it's like sci-fi and romance. Maybe that's the way I can describe it. So thank you for joining. I will see you guys next month. I want to make some more videos this year as well, just cataloging overall reading goals, talking about different authors that I've read a lot of books from, talking about different challenges that I'm trying to work my way through. So I hope you guys will stick around for that, and I will see you soon.